Good afternoon, fourth grade. Today we're going to be reading a text that is about the events leading up to the Revolutionary War. You're going to be working with this text in parallel teaching as well. But before we get started, we have a quick write. Based on what you've learned so far, why did the American colonists in Great Britain want to go to war? Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready for the focus question. It says, why did the American colonists in Great Britain want to go to war? Our vocabulary words for today are debt. That's when you owe someone something, typically money. Draw a line to this picture. The next word is claim. When you claim something like land, you're saying, this is my land. You're claiming it as your own. This is a picture of an astronaut from the United States landing on the moon and claiming the moon as part of the United States. And then the last one is the militia. A militia is a group of people who decide to fight in an army. They're not trained soldiers for the military. They're just a group of people who decided to form their own army. That would be these people. Turn the page, and we have our questions, and we're going to begin reading in our text with the section Slaves in America. But before we get started, we're going to ask our how or why question about the title, The Revolutionary War. And my how question is, how did the American Revolution begin? Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready for the text. We're at Slaves Arrive in America. The first black Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619. They were treated as indentured servants, people who came to America under contract to work for an employer for a period of years. About a decade later, the first African slaves arrived in New Amsterdam, current-day New York City. By the end of the 17th century, every colony had slaves. On the eve of the American Revolution, about 1 in 5 colonists was a slave. Around 500,000 people, most black Africans, were enslaved in the southern colonies. But there were slaves all over the colonies, including big cities like Boston and New York. So we'll stop right there because 1B tells us, how did slaves arrive in America? And if we go back to what we underlined in the text, we know slaves arrived in America in New Amsterdam, which is now called New York City. And by the end of the 17th century, every colony had slaves. So I would write down these two sentences in 1B. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready to keep reading. I'm at International War breaks out. By 1750, the British, French, and Spanish all held claims to various parts of North America. In 1754, the French built a fort in the disputed Ohio Valley, leading to an attack on the French fort by the colonial militia led by young George Washington. The attack sparked a war which became known as the French and Indian War. While the British sent thousands of troops to the colonies to lead the war effort, France relied on its Indian allies. The war finally ended in 1763 with the France ceding all of Canada to Britain. As a result, Britain became the dominant colonial power in eastern North America, and the American colonists were able to settle in new parts. If we go to 2A, it says, why did international war break out? And if we go back in the text, it says that George Washington led a militia group to attack a French fort in the Ohio Valley, and that started the French and Indian War. So in 2A, we would write, The French and American colonists both wanted the same land in the Ohio Valley. George Washington attacked the French fort and started the French and Indian War. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready to keep reading. We're at colonists are taxed. Despite its victory, the war left Britain in great debt. To pay it off, the British government issued a Stamp Act in 1765, forcing colonists to buy a stamp for every piece of paper they used. Many colonists were furious. For decades, they had made their own laws, and now a parliament hundreds of miles away was taxing them? Newspapers mocked the act, and many protested by refusing to buy the stamps. The Stamp Act was repealed several months later, but not before the seeds of anti-British sentiment had begun to spread throughout the colonies. In 1767, the British Parliament further angered the colonists. Intent on raising money to keep British troops in America, the Parliament issued the Townshend Acts. These acts taxed American colonists on common items like tea, clothes, and lead. In response, the groups of colonists organized a boycott of British goods. In 1770, the British Parliament repealed all the Townshend Acts except the tax on tea. Okay, if we stop right there in 2b, it says, why were the colonists taxed? And we have two reasons in our text that we highlighted. We said that Great Britain was in debt. That means they owed a lot of money because of the war, so they decided to tax the colonists. And they wanted to keep their British troops in America to watch and control the colonists, so they had to pass even more taxes. So in 2b, we would write, the colonists were taxed because King George III wanted them to pay the debt they accrued during the French and Indian War, and to raise money to keep the British troops in America. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready to keep reading. We're at shots are fired. By the spring of 1770, tensions in Boston between the colonists and British soldiers was high. On March 5th, a mob of colonists surrounded a British sentry. Soon after, British soldiers fired into the crowd, killing 5 Bostonians. The Boston Massacre was as the event became known, stirred up passion throughout the colonies. Some called the British troops to leave the colonies for good and to allow the colonies to be free from British rule. This group became known as Patriots. Others remained loyal to the British king. These colonists were known as Loyalists, and they hoped that the colonies would remain under British control. Our question in box 3A says, why were shots fired? If we go back in our text, we know that the British soldiers shot the Boston citizens because tensions between the colonists and the soldiers were high. So in 3A, we will write, shots were fired because tensions increased between the American colonists and the British soldiers. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready to keep reading. Go to turn the page in your text. We're at the section that says tea is dumped. The colonists' boycott of British goods, especially that of tea, had greatly diminished the profits of the British East India Company. By 1773, the company needed to sell millions of pounds of tea or go broke. In an attempt to rescue the company, the British government actually lowered the cost of tea so that the colonists would buy it. Soon, the company gained complete control over the tea trade in the colonies. Patriot leaders in Boston, known as the Sons of Liberty, were enraged that the British company had gained a monopoly on the drinking habits of the colonists. And so, on December 16, 1773, they dumped about 90,000 pounds of tea into the Boston harbor. This event became known as the Boston Tea Party. When news of the event reached Britain, Parliament reacted with a new set of laws, so harsh they were termed the Intolerable Acts. Our 3B asks us, why was tea dumped? And if we go back in our text, we know that the Sons of Liberty dumped the tea into the Boston harbor because the British company had a monopoly on the tea. That means that the American tea companies were losing money. So in 3B, we would write, the Sons of Liberty dumped tea into the Boston harbor because they were angry that the British company had a monopoly on the drinking habits of the colonists. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready to keep reading. We're at colonists begin to organize. In September 1774, Patriots and Loyalist leaders from the 12 colonies convened at the First Continental Congress. They agreed to send a letter to the British King George asking for the repeal of the Intolerable Acts. They also decided to initiate a peaceful boycott of British goods and to meet again in May. Throughout the winter and spring of 1774 through 75, leaders urged colonists to continue to boycott British goods. They also organized local militias where volunteers called Minutemen trained to be ready to fight in case of a rebellion. Box 3 asks us, why did the colonists organize? And if we go back in our text, they went to the First Continental Congress because they wanted to write King George a letter asking him to repeal the Intolerable Acts and to organize a boycott of British goods. In box 4A, you would write, the colonists organized at the First Continental Congress because they wanted to write a letter to King George III asking him to repeal the Intolerable Acts and initiate a boycott of British goods. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready to keep reading. Okay, and then in the next section, the colonists, the British troops were going to take all of their weapons in Massachusetts, and so the colonists and the Minutemen got together and they actually fought the British soldiers at Lexington and Concord. And now we're at the American Revolution begins. In May 1775, colonial leaders met again in Philadelphia during the Second Continental Congress. There they chose George Washington to lead the Continental Army against the British. They also set about managing the war effort and writing the Declaration of Independence. And then a bunch of copies of a book called Common Sense were sold, persuading people to join in the rebellion against Great Britain. And in the last paragraph it says, despite Washington's ragtag army, the Continental Army had some early successes, including pushing the British out of Boston in March 1776. Washington then moved his army south, anticipating a British naval attack on New York City. By May 1776, New York residents felt an attack by the British was imminent. Box 4B is our main idea. It says, how did the American Revolution begin? When the Second Continental Congress met, write this down in 4B. When the Second Continental Congress met, they chose George Washington to lead the Continental Army, and they decided to write the Declaration of Independence. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready for the paragraph. The paragraph says, why was revolution in the air? So you need to write down your main idea from box 4B, and then you need to include details in your paragraph and quotes from the text.